Civil aviation has entered a dangerous new era now that Russia has expanded its campaign of sabotage in Northern Europe to attack civil aviation directly. The question we're going to address in today's episode is whether those attacks are limited to the planting of incendiary devices on board aircraft, or whether Russia has also started hacking navigational systems to destroy aircraft and kill flight crew. In particular, with the November 25th crash of a DHL 737 freighter in Vilnius, Lithuania. To be clear, we don't yet know the answer to this question. But a point I've repeated several times in this podcast is that in a compromised environment like the one we live in today, we have to ask questions before we can find the answers. We know that Russia is using hacking attacks against the West. We know that they are tampering with navigational signals in the form of GPS spoofing. And we know that they are engaging in sabotage that can destroy aircraft and kill people. It would be irresponsible, in my opinion, to not explore the possibility that they are directly hacking aircraft with people dying as a result. As Dr. Krishna Sampagataya told us in last episode, in order to have a cyber attack, you need to have an attack surface and a threat actor. The attack surface, meaning the vulnerability through which an attack can be carried out, is something we've talked about and we'll talk about more. First, I want to talk about the threat actor. First, some context. Back in July, 2 incendiary devices ignited in warehouses storing cargo for the German delivery and shipping company DHL. In both cases, the goods were scheduled to travel aboard cargo planes, but they went off before they could be loaded on board. Here are some security cam images of one of the devices igniting a pallet. Obviously, this is a very scary thing to have happen on board a plane. If it had gone off in flight, it could easily have caused a fire that could have destroyed the plane, killing everyone on board, and presumably people on the ground as well. Fire aboard a plane is one of the scariest things that can happen to a pilot because things can get unrecoverable very quickly. According to Western intelligence sources cited by the New York Times, the devices were planted by Russian agents and, quote, the effort represents a potentially significant escalation of the Kremlin's sabotage operations against Western adversaries. Around the same time, Polish authorities intercepted 2 other devices, which they believed were part of a test run for a possible attack on flights to the U.S. or Canada. 4 people were arrested in Poland as part of the alleged plot. The Guardian reported, quote, Ken McCullum, the head of the MI5, this is British intelligence, warned that Russians' GRU military intelligence appeared to be on, quote, a sustained mission to generate mayhem on British and European streets. We've seen arson, sabotage, and more. So all that set the stage for what happened early in the morning on November 25th, when a DHL plane en route from Leipzig, Germany to Vilnius, Lithuania, crashed as it was coming into land at the airport under instrument conditions. For unknown reasons, the plane hit the ground about 0.8 of a mile short of the runway, skidded several hundred yards before hitting residential houses and set fire to them, as well as several other buildings and cars. 1 crew member was killed and 3 others were injured, some critically. But officially, authorities are not saying that the crash was linked with earlier incidents with the incendiary devices. But obviously, it's hard not to be incredibly suspicious. We have a cargo plane that is flying for DHL. I mean, technically, it was being operated by another carrier that was hired by DHL. It was a sort of a joint livery, DHL Spirit Air, but it's DHL. And it's going from Leipzig to Vilnius, 2 cities featured prominently in the earlier attacks. If this is just a coincidence, it is one of the great amazing coincidences of aviation history. Of course, with MH370, we're used to amazing coincidences, of course, but still. So State Security Department Chief Darius Jariskis apologies for the mispronunciation, told reporters, quote, "It is premature to associate it with anything or to make any attributions." Of course, it's early. We don't know much. He went on, "We cannot rule out the case of terrorism. We have warned that such things are possible. We see an increasingly aggressive Russia, but we cannot make any attributions or point fingers yet." Of course, we need to be careful. A full investigation needs to be done. And I just, again, want to emphasize the Vilnius crash did not involve incendiary devices. One of the three survivors were quoted as saying that everything had seemed normal. But, that doesn't mean that the flight couldn't have been sabotaged in other ways. So let's review what happened. The plane had departed from Leipzig, which is DHL's main hub, about 4:10 a.m., and it was coming in to land in Vilnius an hour and 15 minutes later, not a super long flight. Conditions were overcast, close to freezing. There was rain and snow in the vicinity. The cloud cover was overcast at 500 feet, so there was a 500-foot ceiling above the runway. And the plane was on a Category 1 ILS approach, which meant that the crew had to be able to see the runway when it was 200 feet above the ground. So if it was lower than 200 feet and they still couldn't see the runway, they would have to go around. So typically, this kind of approach is flown on autopilot until the plane reaches that decision height, after which it's flown by hand. That's typical. It could have been flown by hand the whole time. It couldn't have really been flown by autopilot after that, I think, according to procedures. But anyway, I really recommend Juan Brown's video on the crash. As a pilot, he gives a very insightful description of what the approach looks like from the perspective of a professional flight crew. Basically, in his estimation, the crew was coming in a little hot, a little fast, but that from his perspective, this was understandable. It was early in the morning. They probably were keen to get home, get into their beds, and so forth. So it's not unusual. Cargo pilots, and viewers can correct me if they feel this is an unjust characterization, but you can fly a little rougher, faster than in a plane that's full of passengers who might be holding hot coffee in their hand or something. So you can come in a little hotter, slow it up a little bit more abruptly. They got onto the ILS, the instrument landing system, and they kind of made a right-hand turn as they got lined up for the ILS. And at first, they weren't quite on target, but then they quickly got on to target. So when they were about 5 miles out, they were lined up for the approach. So at this point, they're descending through the clouds, and they're dependent on the automated system to get them safely through the clouds and into the clear air below where they can see the runway and land the plane. The way this works is that antennas on the ground send out radio frequency signals in sort of two sets of lobes. They're kind of going outwards in two patches. And one, called the localizer, puts a lobe on the left and a lobe on the right of the inbound path. And so if you're coming in and the receiver gets too much of one signal, that means they're too far to the right. And if they're too far on the other way, they're too far to the left. And then another set of lobes above and below the inbound path, the vertical descent angle tells the plane if it's descending at the correct glide slope. It's called the glide slope. So that the vertical guidance is called glide slope. The horizontal guidance is called localizer. And they both work by basically the same principle. It's just two different sets of radio signals. So as the plane was coming to land, it was right on the glide slope when it was 4.5 miles out. But after that, it got progressively further and further too low below the glide slope. So when it was 4 miles out, it was 85 feet too low. At 3 miles out, it was 150 feet too low. At 2 miles out, it was 180 feet below the glide slope. This is the point at which the plane would have popped out of the clouds and the runway would have become visible ahead. Now, visually, it would have presented a slightly strange looking picture. The plane was too low and the angle of the runway. So at this point, it's nighttime. You can't really see the ground. You can see lights of houses and streets and buildings and so forth to the extent that they're on at that hour. This is pre-dawn darkness. Most people probably aren't up yet, but you've got the runway lights, and I'll put up a picture so you can see what the angle should have looked like if the plane was too low or if the plane is too high. And bear in mind that if the pilots thought they were on the glide slope, as they no doubt had been in countless other flights before this day, they sort of were expecting everything to go smoothly. It would have taken them some time to process. It takes time as a pilot to, if something unusual happens, it takes you a little while to figure out what's going on. In any case, they didn't realize that they were too low right away. It took them some time. The plane continued to descend at too steep an angle, and it impacted the ground a mile further along from where it would have come out from the clouds, and then 28 seconds later. So there was a 28-second gap between the plane coming out into the clear air and it hitting the ground. So it does look like the flight crew might have tried to pull up at the very last few seconds, but it was too late. The plane hit the ground. I don't know if we can really call it a crash. I mean, it was a hard landing, basically. I mean, it slid. The plane is destroyed. It's amazing that 3 people survived, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the question is, what caused the plane to get below the proper glide slope? And there are various non-nefarious ways that this could happen. For instance, there was a case back in 2019 when an Embraer 145 regional jet was coming in to land at Presque Isle, Maine. There was a lot of snow on the ground, and it seemed to have interfered with the ILS localizer transmitter, causing the plane. So this is the horizontal guidance. So when the plane landed, it veered off to the side of the runway, even though the needle was centered. So it had gotten a wrong signal. It wasn't anything nefarious. It was just that the equipment was essentially malfunctioning because there was too much snow. They cleared the snow away and it started working again. So in the Vilnius case, if there was a similar kind of error with the glide slope transmitter, that could have caused what happened. Of course, you would expect that if it was that kind of equipment malfunction, that other aircraft coming in on the same evening or the same morning would have experienced the same problem. Another possibility is that someone might have tampered with a system. In 2019, a researcher named Harshad Sathaye, who was at the time a postdoc at Northeastern University in Boston, published a paper in which he described a way that a malicious attacker could inject false data into the ILS system in such a way that it would confuse the autopilot that's following the ILS signal and potentially cause a crash. Today, Harshad is continuing his research at ETH Zurich, a research university in Switzerland, and he very generously took the time to explain to me how ILS works and how an attacker could exploit the vulnerability. So, Harshad, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I'm really fascinated by your work, and especially in a paper that you published in 2019, Wireless Attacks on Aircraft Instrument Landing Systems. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you developed that idea and where you presented it.
Yes. So first of all, thanks a lot for your interest in my work. So this was my first paper when I started my PhD. And the main motivation for this work was the movie Die Hard 2. Because I mean, I used to watch Die Hard movies a lot, one of my favorite movies. And there's in the second part, they have this scenario where the bad guys do like mess up with ILS, and the consequences are bad.
Approach speed 140.
Approach speed 140.
130.
130. Altitude 1,000 feet.
800, guys. You're only at 800 feet.
Fire and rescue is coming. Roll everything out to runway 29er.
Ref speed plus 20. 600 feet.
Looking good, Windsor. Now watch it. 30-knot crosswinds and the runway is icy. Atta boy, we've got you. We've got you.
this is fiction for sure, but what are the possibilities that someone can do this, right? Because a lot of times science is inspired from science fiction. So that's when I started looking into these systems more closely. And it turns out ILS is it's an analog system which was designed back in, I don't know, 40s and 50s, so a long time back, when security of these systems was probably not the first thought on the minds of designers who developed this system. Because I mean, you want to get the functionality right, and then security was probably not even an afterthought. So it's a really old system. And then once I started looking into it, we saw that, okay, with some effort, you can recreate the signals with commercial hardware. And
Well, I should specify that while you might have gotten this idea about spoofing ILS while watching a Die Hard movie, your field is aviation cybersecurity. It's not like you're some random moviegoer who was like, I think I'll build this system. This is your area of expertise. You are a post-grad student at ETH University in Zurich, Switzerland right now. You've been doing this for many years, and you've looked not only at ILS, but you've looked at a variety of aircraft systems. On my podcast, I've talked about ADS-B and GPS spoofing. The question is, I think, increasingly relevant. This is a claim I've made several times, that aviation cybersecurity is going to become more and more important as the world becomes more and more interconnected, and AI becomes more of a powerful force. But so just with that sort of, setup, you are someone who's actually highly experienced and knowledgeable about this field. And so you actually took it upon yourself to kind of build a mock-up of the ILS system that you could then see if playing the role of an attacker, you could spoof a signal that might mislead an innocent landing pilot in his aircraft to miss the runway, essentially.
yes,
And I guess maybe I should also preface this by saying that the instrument landing system is, as you say, an analog radio beacon system, essentially, that sends out these signals that, by using hardware on the plane that is built to receive these signals, an incoming aircraft that's coming into land in weather situations, so we can't see the runway maybe because of clouds or fog, can ride this signal down and can land at the airfield. Now, there's two parts of it, right? There's lateral, side-to-side guidance, and there's also vertical, meaning are you too high or are you too low as you're kind of flying this imaginary, like a slide into the runway. I fly small planes. I'm not instrument rated, so I don't know how to use an ILS in real life. But in visual flight, there's a kind of an analogous system where as you're coming in to land, you see there's a couple of lights that are either white or they're red. And if there's mostly white, that means you're too high. If they're mostly red, it means you're too low. And if it's equal white and red, that means that you're good. And so you want to balance the white and the red. I want to do a really bad analogy because this is actually highly complicated. It's very interesting. I think mathematicians would be really delighted by how these lobes of radio energy interact with each other and produce these phase oscillations and things that are actually way above my pay grade. But let me draw an analogy, and you can tell me if it's like good enough for our present purposes, which is that if white means you're too high and red means you're too low, and if they're balanced, that's on the glide slope, an attacker could conceivably like sneak near the airport and sort of shine a white light, and that would make the pilot think that he was too high, and he would descend and wind up being too low. Actually, in your paper, you talk about two different kinds of attacks. One is sort of swamping the ILS system on the ground transmitter, with basically your spoofed signal that would sort of overwhelm the real ILS signal. Another one you looked at is just by spoofing one lobe of the
Right.
signal, so that you're, in the analogy of like, you're just, if you just give a lot of white light, that means that the needle on the aircraft or the automated system that's looking at the signal will make an erroneous correction. And in your paper,
Correct.
actually, you even put up a video, or you linked to a video that showed, in this case, the horizontal displacement. But whether up or
Yes.
down or sideways, the idea is that by injecting this erroneous signal, you can kind of induce the system to correct in the wrong way.
Correct. So the main principle there is depend. So there are two tones, 90 hertz and 150 hertz tones, which are amplitude modulated and then transmitted. So the receiver, what it does is actually a little bit of background. So the transmitter part, as you mentioned, is quite complex because it uses a phased antenna array with up to like 14 elements, and then each antenna element transmits the same signal with a phase shift, which on the far end of the antenna, they kind of add up in space in a certain way, and then makes one tone more dominating than the other tone in certain regions. So, but the receiver is quite simple. Like the design is quite simple, and it's absolutely elegant. That it really gets the combined signal and then calculates the signal strength or the energy of each frequency, 90 and 150 hertz. And then depending on the difference, it determines whether it's on the left or the right side. So, and then what we found out is, as an attacker, what you would have to do is you'll have to manipulate this difference in depth of modulation. So, if you make the receiver believe that 150 hertz is stronger, then it's going to say, you're on the 150 hertz side, and then you can you can correct for that behavior.
So and also the attack that you are hypothesizing or proposing would be specific to an aircraft coming into land. You would have to know where you would sort of derive its location probably from the GPS
Exactly.
location being transmitted over ADS-B.
Correct. So in our paper, we have a very similar scenario where we say, okay, we know the aircraft's location from ADS-B, and from this location we can calculate what should be the expected ILS measurement, because we know its position with respect to the center line and its altitude on the 3-degree path. And based on that, we can calculate the actual dots or the deviation of the needle, and then use that in our calculation.
And this is something that would require the attacker to be on or near the airfield? Or could they be like in front of the airfield, like in between the airfield and the incoming plane?
Yes. So there are again two scenarios. One is for an overshadow attack, where the attacker essentially transmits the entire ILS signal as it would look at the receiver, and that attack is like a brute force. You just blast off with higher power than the receiver, than the legitimate transmitter, and then the receiver will lock on to the stronger signal. So it's a classic capture effect in wireless. So for that, all you need to know is where the aircraft is, what's the expected ILS measurement, and what the ILS measurement you want to spoof or you want the ILS to believe. So in that case, the best is if you are on the direct line of sight with the aircraft, and as close as you're to the aircraft and the transmitter, the less power you would need to overshadow.
But so you wouldn't necessarily need to be on the runway or near the runway. You could be outside the actual.
Yes, for the first attack, which is a brute force, yes. but you would still need to be in the radio range of the receiver.
So we don't know exactly how close to the airfield you would need to be, but you couldn't be at an arbitrary location. You'd have to be in front of the plane.
Yes. So
Okay.
so that's why the best location would be on the center line, because you're always looking at because the attacker's antenna is always looking at the aircraft, and the antenna or the attacker's position is on the antenna pattern.
Okay. Okay. Now, you published this in 2019, and now more recently, and the reason I reached out to you is because, as you know, there were a number of arson attacks, sabotage attacks carried out against DHL packages that were involved in Leipzig in Germany and Vilnius in Lithuania. Now,
Right.
come to November 25th, a DHL plane, actually operated by another company called Swift Air, but it's a DHL operated aircraft that's going from Leipzig to Vilnius, and it crashes. Of the 4 people on board, 3 survived. One of them
Exactly.
said that there was no kind of fire, there was nothing like that. Everything seemed normal. And so this leads to the question of, could this have been an instantiation of the kind of attack that you hypothesized in 2019? What do you think?
So, as we say in the paper, the attack may look simple, but it's actually quite complicated than that to actually execute. First of all, you need resources to be able to have this, and then yeah. So it's not a matter of getting a radio, plugging it into your computer, and transmitting out signals. So it does require a fair bit of skill and expertise, and not just in terms of wireless and signal processing, but also from perspective of flight dynamics, approach patterns, and all of these things.
Okay.
that-
In your paper, you cited work involved at the University of Texas involving using smart spoofing to inject false GPS signals to take over an autopilot, in this case aboard a boat. Would you think that the ILS attack would be sort of a level of technical complexity similar to that?
I think it would be a bit more than that, because first of all, pilots are really well trained, and as you know, there's a lot of procedures, there's a lot of groundwork that you have to do, and then it's all instincts, right? So if you do an attack similar to the one of the yacht capture, you would notice a sudden jump in the localizer needle, because you are vectoring in and you're flying the leg, and then coming in for the final, and then you're making, in this case, a right turn. So you're coming in on the left side of the the runway center line, which means that when you're entering or when you're capturing the localizer, it's going to capture it in a certain way. You're not going to start off from one position and then jump to the other one. So if the attacker does not consider the aircraft's current position and then computes the signal accordingly, there will be 2 jumps. One is when there's a first localizer capture, and the second jump is when the attacker resets it to whatever needle deflection that the attacker wants. And this is something which would be quite noticeable for pilots.
Is there a way that problem could be overcome by a clever attacker with lots of resources?
Yes. So if you're able to track the plane, calculate in real time, and also predict what the next location would be in order to, and we kind of explore that angle as well in the paper, where we have this smooth takeover, where we consider where the aircraft comes in on the final, and then use that to manipulate ILS so that the instrument doesn't show any kind of jump.
And Another aspect to it is that you might not need to be fooling the pilot, right? You might be the pilot, the autopilot might be flying the glide slope, not the pilot, right?
Exactly, and that's another point of that was our concern as well when we were like working on this paper is since there's auto land, the problem is quite tricky here because if there's a pilot in command who is watching altitude and then the autopilot is following the glide path, then I think you can very easily say that, oh, you are supposed to be on a certain point from threshold, but you are high.
Right.
Because if you follow the 3-degree path, then there's a very strict altitude. I mean, yes, you can have a tolerance on altitude, but you cannot be higher or lower than a certain value.
I see. I had sent you a table with some of the values where it shows that this plane seemed to have been steadily descending, not a huge amount, not super abruptly, but a little bit. And when you're on a 3% glide slope, it doesn't take a whole lot of feet. So ultimately, the plane impacted about a kilometer short of the runway when it was several hundred feet too low.
Right.
And so I guess my main question is, okay, just first saying that in this area we know there is a big problem with cyber attacks against aviation and in the form of spoofing, jamming, and also this kind of smart spoofing where a navigation system can be led astray in a way that's fairly sophisticated. And so if we imagine that there is a threat actor out there who might be looking to cause sabotage, chaos, even plane crashes, is and also saying that we don't know a lot yet. We haven't even had a preliminary report. So all we know is pretty much what can be gleaned from ADSB at this point.
Right. So it's all
But
speculation.
knowing that is what we see is the limited amount that we know so far, at least theoretically consistent with a possible attack. Like can we rule it out already?
So I would say it's kind of like so first of all, executing an attack in academics, I mean, it's kind of an unlikely scenario. But I don't think it would be wise to say anything until there's a full report on it, on what the official discovered from the flight. Because detecting this or through forensics or examining the data logs would not be very difficult because assuming that the flight recorders are in perfect condition, then you can match the needle deflections for ILS with their current GPS position and then with the expected measurements, and then that should already give a clear picture of what if ILS was the culprit here.
Okay, so what you're saying is the black box, the flight data recorder, will record the value of the ILS needle deflection.
Yes, I mean that's what I would expect. So I am not exactly sure all the parameters that black box records, but from some of the previous incidences that I've looked at and some reports that were released, I think it's possible that they also record ILS because I mean it's one of the most crucial navigation systems while landing. So I would assume that they also record this data.
Right. So if this was the kind of spoofing attack like you propose, then the flight data recorder will show that the ILS needle was centered, the glide slope was centered, when in fact it was several hundred feet below.
Exactly.
And so that would be a telltale sign that this kind of attack was. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, is there an equipment failure or some other kind of human error? Is there some other way that that could be produced innocently.
Yes, actually, there have been incidences in the past where similar failures have occurred for ILS. For example, especially with glide slope, they are notorious to side lobes, because even if it's a very directional antenna, it's not perfect. So you can have a false glide slope acquisition, which is either above or below the actual glide slope.
I guess I'm wondering if it's possible that when the investigators look at the black box data, it's possible that they're unable to tell whether it was an attack or some other explanation that just happens to be a result of atmospheric conditions or something else. Hopefully not. Hopefully they would be able to rule out any other explanations. I mean, listen, the reason that a lot of the work that you do, including this 2019 paper, has to do with imagining things that bad people could do,
yes,
so that we can be prepared.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that one of the points that you make is that ILS is a pre-digital technology. It's analog. It was made long before the concept of cybersecurity even existed. There is no security layer, and as you point out in your paper, like it's hard to even conceive of how one would implement a security layer.
Yes.
And one of the things that's come up in some of my previous discussions is the idea that when you're relying on a single stream of data, it's a lot easier to spoof a single stream of data, to mislead someone or to manipulate a single stream of data, than if there's multiple. So when people are worried about, for instance, GPS spoofing, you can look at other sources of navigational information in the environment, including ambient radio waves, and you can even use like a visual map of your environment and so forth. With ILS, as it's presently configured, it's all dependent on this one signal that, as you've pointed out, if you're sophisticated enough and you can send a masking incorrect signal, you can fool this system in a way that, yes, you can double check it by checking your radar altimeter, your barometric altimeter. You can look out the window and see if you seem high or low. All of these things can be done, but if you're stressed, tired, in zero visibility conditions, your options get less and less and less, and it's easy to fall afoul. And this case took place in the wee hours of the morning. Fatigue very likely was a factor. The cloud base, I think, was something like 600 or 800 feet, so they would have been out of it by shortly before they hit the ground, but they might not have had enough time to react given their fatigue and so forth.
Yeah. So this is something that we were not able to test, is how pilots' physical and psychological factors come into play when such scenarios or they encounter such scenarios. And I think that's something pretty interesting to look at.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's, like as you mentioned with the radar altimeter, there's a lot of redundancy that's available. So it's not just one system, and then if this one system and then it's game over otherwise.
Okay.
So there's a lot of redundancy. So yeah.
Just in terms of like looking at the other instruments, cross-checking.
Exactly. And yeah.
I mean, another factor that could be at play here on top of fatigue was the idea that these guys were flying it fast. And I've been on planes where like it's clear that the pilot wanted to get home. He came in hot. He came in they were basically slowing the plane up. It wasn't like a leisurely stabilized approach. It was within parameters. They were on the glide slope. They had captured the ILS properly, but it was all done very fast. And so they didn't give themselves the leisure of being able to kind of, check everything out. I guess
it was not a very stable approach, as you would say.
Yeah, but it was. It will be very interesting to say if the black box does not contain the ILS glide slope information. I wonder if they could have a hard time of demonstrating whether it was an ILS attack or not.
Yes, that would be indeed quite difficult because like to basically find out the cause, right?
Another aspect of this case was that they seem to have they might have lost radio contact during the final approach because there was a miscommunication about the frequency.
Yes.
So that would make everything more complicated as well. But as you say, there are some fixes that one can imagine, including the tower monitoring the approach of aircraft and telling them, "Hey, listen, you are not on glide slope. Go around," or what have you.
Yes. So again, like the deviation from the glide slope, as you mentioned, I just saw the table that you sent. When I look at the 4 mile mark, and you're only off by like 90 feet. So I'm not sure if that would be noticed by anyone on the ground saying, "Oh, you're off by 90 feet from a 3-degree path."
Right.
And I think unless you are specifically looking for that, I'm not sure if ATC has the equipment to confirm whether someone is on the correct glide path.
Harshad, we can talk about different fixes to different kinds of attacks, but there's a kind of a meta problem, which is that if you are aviation is a system that it was designed to get people to overcome the rather daunting challenge of getting human beings thousands of miles from point A to point B. It's a hard enough problem as it is. It wasn't really designed with a mind of like, oh, and what if at the same time someone's trying to mess with us, trying to make us crash? And so now we've kind of perfected the first part. I mean, frankly, I feel like aviation safety is so good, it's almost ridiculous. But now we're left with this other problem, which we weren't expecting, which is, no, there's actually people out there that want to mess with us. And it's not just like, okay, how do we make ILS secure? But how do we cope with the fact that aviation has, as I talked about in an earlier episode of my podcast, like a huge attack surface, a lot of different ways that a clever and resourceful person could mess with it. How do we have to sort of change our whole outlook on how we design and build these systems, how we operate these systems in an environment in which someone is trying to find our weak points constantly, and you're the white hat. You're the good guy who's thinking, okay, I know that we're in a world where we have a sort of hodgepodge of different technologies that have come together over the decades. As you say, this was started. I think the first instrument landing system was in like 1912 or something. I mean, it wasn't nearly what they have today, of course, but.
Right.
My point is that these technologies are a real like Frankenstein monster, and if your job is to attack it, you're sitting pretty because there's lots of ways you can attack it. And your job, you're going to stay really busy, I think, in the years to come because you're trying to think of all the different ways that a resourceful and malicious person, of which there is actually, or they are out there. It's.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was more of a statement than a question.
Right. So that's actually a very important question, and the main motivation for all of us who work in this area is to bring about this awareness that the systems that we are using today are not secure, and we need to make changes like yesterday. And the most important thing is, in most cases, security is thought of is kind of an afterthought, which in some cases it kind of makes sense because you want to provide a service and then you want to make sure that it's operational and it's available and whatnot. But in this digital domain, I think, or in today's world, I think it's most important to also have security baked in the design itself, rather than just patching things when bugs are found. And so that's our main motivation. And then most of our research also goes towards that, like where we are trying to come up with new systems with which have security right at the designing and right at the design stage, rather than creating a patch 5 years later.
Well, as you said, the best time to do this is yesterday because it takes time. Whenever you introduce a technology, it takes years and even decades for that technology
Absolutely.
to roll out and be implemented in all the legacy aircraft and all the legacy fleets and everything.
Yeah.
But the changing the technologies, changing procedures is downstream of changing the mindset of people in the aviation industry who have not traditionally been oriented towards security. And so I thought it was very interesting when this incident happened that very quickly the Germans and I think the Lithuanians as well were like, yeah, this could be sabotage. We don't know.
Right.
We don't know. And the
Yeah.
Americans very quickly were like, no, this can't be sabotage.
Yes.
And I feel like, listen, I mean, I think it should be non-controversial at this point to say that given the little amount that we know right now, it's impossible to rule this out as an attack.
Yes, I mean, as still the investigation is ongoing, pretty much everything is possible, right? So can't say for certain what's the case.
It must be exciting, or at least interesting, as someone who imagines attacks that could be carried out, to have something happen in the news very prominently that looks like, oh, this could be it. This could be one of them. I mean, what's it like when you heard the news?
Okay, people were saying, okay, maybe it's GPS spoofing or something of that sort. And then my first thought was, okay, let's hope it's not that.
Yeah. Let's hope it's not a hack.
So I did thought about it. Maybe it could something be with ILS, because in some cases when there's something wrong on the final approach, then like if you look at instruments, main instruments that are involved are the altimeters and the localizer and the glide slope. So yes, I mean it could be one of these, and yeah.
And I guess we won't know for a while.
We won't know until there's a thorough investigation of the data. And as I said, it's actually not that difficult to determine whether if there was an instrument failure, and if so, whether what was the conditions for this instrument failure.
You know, I think it's whatever the answer turns out to be. I think it's important to change the mindset. As I said, all of these other changes that will make aviation safer come downstream from people changing their mindset. And I think hopefully there could be the benefit of looking at a case like this and sort of saying, well, okay, but before you say no, this can't be an attack, let's hold off judgment. Let's just wait. Let's think about what would it look like. What will the data show us if it is? What will the data show us if it isn't? But let's keep an open mind, and let's not, as the New York Times was citing unnamed U.S. officials saying this couldn't have been a hack. Maybe they know something we don't. But I'm hoping that this could, at the very least, be a good educational moment to talk about the fact that we have to think about this stuff, especially in an environment where this GPS spoofing and jamming has been going on like gangbusters in the Baltics, among other places.
Exactly.
Harshad, thank you so much for taking the time. Your work is fascinating. You are at the cutting edge of a field that is going to be increasingly important, and I really am grateful to you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
After I spoke to Harshad, I reached out to Todd Humphreys, one of the world's most respected aviation cybersecurity experts. We've had him on the show. And I asked him if he thought that given what we know about the Vilnius crash right now, limited information at this point still, but given that we know what we know now, if he felt that it might be a case of malicious attack against the ILS system. He said, and this is what he said in response by email, he said, quote, "I don't think we can rule out ILS spoofing. The video evidence seemed to show a steep downward trajectory with a sudden pull-up just before the crash, which would be consistent with ILS spoofing, but inconsistent with an onboard explosion. Also, although there have been no cases of ILS spoofing of which I'm aware, ILS is eminently spoofable. It's a well-understood signal." Now, to be sure, at this point, we're just speculating. but not just for speculation's sake. We want to raise the possibility so that investigators can rule it in or rule it out. The issue that I discussed with Harshad is that there will be a telltale sign. The flight data recorders will show that the ILS glide slope needle will have been lined up, even though the plane was actually below the glide slope. And crucially, no other plane that came into land around the same time experienced that kind of same disruption. So we can make a prediction as to what investigators will find. If this is a nefarious act, they should find on the flight data recorder that the needle was lined up, even though the plane clearly was below it. Unfortunately, at this point, we're just going to have to wait. I reached out to Lithuania's Air Crash Investigation Agency, and I was told that they hope to have a preliminary report out before Christmas. Whether this report will include glide slope information, we don't know. Last Monday, December 9th, the agency released a statement that said, in part, quote, preliminary analysis of the FDR and CVR, aka black box data, has revealed no signs or indications of unlawful interference. I think at this point, that statement is ambiguous as to whether investigators found a deflection of the glide slope needle. I reached out to a spokesman, and he replied by email. He said, I consulted the team regarding your question about the ILS glide slope parameter. However, the data retrieved from the black boxes is still being analyzed. As such, the lead investigator prefers to refrain from commenting at this stage as the information remains inconclusive. Nevertheless, we are open to addressing this question later as the investigation progresses. That's very interesting, I think. It's an open question. So I think that it's good that we're asking this question. We're not just raising speculation. We're not just pointing fingers, but we're saying we need to consider the possibility. It's a novel possibility, and it has to be raised because people certainly aren't going to look at this out of habit. It's never happened before. The Germans, who are very aware of all of the different kinds of sorts of sabotage that Russian agents have been carrying out in their area, including cutting communications cables. They're very attuned to the possibility that the crash was a result of Russian interference. Bundeswehr Chief Inspector Carsten Breuer, speaking on a German talk show, said that if Putin was behind the crash of the DHL plane in Vilnius, he would have created a hybrid state of affairs, quote, a state that is no longer peaceful, but not yet full-scale war either. He added, this involves testing how far one can push. The general's assessment paints the incident not as an isolated aviation mishap, but as a calculated move aimed at probing the resilience of the West. This is not about Ukraine nor about Russia. It's about the West, Breuer continued. He suggested that Putin's goal is to discredit the Western system to prevent it from gaining influence in Russia. I think this should be seen as scary. Historically, aviation has been treated as sacrosanct. All parties around the world took a hands-off approach when it came to attacking civil aviation. We all remember how the United States got into World War I because of the sinking of the Lusitania, a civilian passenger ship. Shooting down an airliner is like sinking the Lusitania. And I have talked on the podcast about other events where Russia caused the hijacking or destruction of passenger jets. This is the first time that they are practically doing it in the open, if that's what this turns out to be. And while it may be cargo jets for the time being, it is a very short step indeed to targeting passenger jets. And the important thing about hybrid warfare is that it involves acts of aggression that are short of triggering all-out war. The idea is to see how far you can get with actually causing shooting. But with this kind of action, we are getting dangerously close to that threshold.